Let's start by paying respects to the traditional owners and to the people and custodians of the land on which we meet. Pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all of the ancestors that have come before us. Together we acknowledge that country and place is as important to the development of shared responsibility for the environment as anything. Now to some housekeeping. We'll try and keep this to 60 minutes. It's being recorded and will be available after the event. If your microphone is not muted, it should be automatically, but if it's not, please mute now to allow the presenters to do their thing. If you have a question to ask, there's three options for you. The first one at the top of your screen, there's a text box, second icon in, where you can type a question and we'll try and get to it. Everyone will see that. Alternatively, you can send an email to info@mesca.com.au or if you like, go to LinkedIn and post a question for us on Mining and Energy Services Council of Australia. We will answer those questions as soon as we can afterwards. And if you have any technical issues, just raise your hand as the third icon along and I'll try and help you out. Today's webinar is titled The State of the National Economy and 2021. To help us understand what this is, we have two excellent speakers. The first one is Andrew Bridger. Andrew is a senior economist for AI Group. He's responsible for the analysis and the commentary on both Australian and international economic developments. Joining AI Group, he spent many years with the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science, and he also worked for a private economic consulting firm in Brisbane. He's got a wealth of experience. He's got a Bachelor of Economics and Finance from the University of Queensland, and he has recently returned to the fine state of Queensland, which is his original home after time in Victoria. A wise move, Andrew, and welcome to today's webinar. Welcome back to Queensland.
Thanks.
Andy's going to talk, will provide an overview of the recent federal budget and update us on the latest economic indicators and have a quick look at some of the signals of what's coming ahead in 2021. Also with us today is an old friend of MESCA, the great Paul Hodgson. Paul's the Brisbane-based General Manager of Innovation and Stakeholder Engagement for National Energy Resources Australia, NERA. He's a very busy man and it's a pleasure to have him with us once again. I think it's been 12 months since you were here last, Paul. So welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, James.
Paul is kind of an everywhere man. He works with many stakeholders throughout Australia to help increase the productivity, the competitiveness and the export potential of the energy resource sector in Australia, which is an emerging and exciting sector. He's also leading a fascinating project for NERA, which is establishing national and regional hydrogen technology clusters, hydrogen being one of the key parts of new energy. He's a busy man. He has qualifications in international business and sustainable development. I've known him for 10 years, but in the last 20 years, he's explored the competitiveness of business, of industries and regions, and he's been designing and implementing strategies to improve performance through innovation and collaboration. So welcome, Paul. It's good to have you here with us once again. Paul's going to talk about what's happening in the national energy sector, the developments in this region, talk about the recent federal policy program and funding announcements, of which there's been a plethora. I also hope, Paul, that you're going to have a chat about what's happening in regards to Australia as part of the global energy powerhouse. Perhaps you can tell us about whether or not where we're sitting in terms of global competitiveness and what's ahead. So both of those two presentations will be very helpful in helping us understand where we're at and where we're going. In terms of where we're at, I think it's been what we could call annus horribilis. It's been a tough year. When you think about it, we started the year as business people facing disruption and digitalization. We were scrambling to catch up with what we needed to do to reposition our business for the future. And whilst we were trying to do that, we got faced with a nationwide national emergency, which took out resources, it took out economic strength, and it took out our logistics and supply chains. It made us difficult to operate. It also reminded us that in our industry we have the need for a social license to operate and that we're connected to the environment around us. We had these challenges facing our industry. And then, of course, the greatest disruption of all time arrived in terms of what's been on our minds and in our talk for the last 7 months, the global pandemic. What a year. But you know what? I think we've learned a lot of good lessons from this year. We've learned that we can pivot as business people. We've learned that if we go down that path of sustainable supply chain, of digitalization, of understanding what the current environment is and not believing in the past, well, then we have the opportunity to be quite strong in the future. So I'm looking forward to next year. And I think that there's some great lessons to learn from this year that we'll use as MESCA next year to help build our industry and our businesses. I also think I've learned that I'm incredibly more efficient working from home, doing this sort of thing, rather than traveling all the time. And although it's good to travel, boy, I have a few more hours every day when I'm not traveling or driving or whatever. And I've also discovered that my wife is way more patient with me than I ever thought possible. Although her eye rolls and her size can be quite big, I'm still living. So there you go. I've learned a lot. Before we get into the presentations, maybe you guys could give us your thoughts about what you've learned over the last 7 months. What about Andy? Have you learned anything from the last 7 months?
Well, yeah, I've gotten a lot more proficient at Teams and Zoom, as I think almost everyone has. But I think one thing I've learned is to try and make time for exercise and for your family. It's very easy when you're, working from home, as I've been for the last 6 months, to kind of, stay connected, 24/7. So it's very important, I think, to block out chunks of time for exercise and for time with your family.
Yeah, it's. I've worked from home for a long time, so it's easy to forget the separation. But this time it's been even more because there's been people trying to learn that same lesson. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Paul? You've been a everywhere man. You work from anywhere that you can plug your computer in, don't you?
Yeah, well, certainly, James, it's been a really interesting year. I think we've all had an accelerated course in becoming broadcasters, and probably with the crazy behind that as well. I've been, before, it's 2 minutes to the next meeting. I've got the microwave on. I'm making myself some lunch. I've got myself hooked up and I'm ready to go, right on time, which I think is kind of the broadcaster experience. I mean, I haven't been on a plane since March. I was probably on a plane every week before that. And what I'm finding is that, I absolutely agree with Andrew there that you really have to make time to do things, but you can do it at odd times, right? So you can make time during the day for something that you wouldn't otherwise normally do. It does mean that you're potentially working in the evenings and the like, but it does give you some flexibility. The other big thing is you really can't plan very much. So I tend to find that my weeks fill up, but not weeks out in advance or months in advance. They actually fill up almost day by day. Because it can be, it used to be, well, I'm going to be in Melbourne next month, let's catch up. Now it's, well, let's jump on a Zoom tomorrow, or what are you doing now? Let's have a phone call. And the same with international as well. So instead of planning out your year, you're actually, you tend to get to the end of the week and you're exhausted, but quite exhilarated as well, because you've had some really interesting interactions.
I think COVID has taught us to react when there's no structure in place. We thought at first we're just going flat out trying to stay on top, and then all of a sudden, I think a lot of us realise that there really is structure in chaos. The chaos theory is true. I saw a meme today that the most common expression in the last 8 months has been, "You're on mute." Let's move forward. Let's talk about where we're at economically. Where's Australia sitting? What's happening, Andy? Tell us the story. Paint the picture for us.
Okay, Brian. Well, I'm just getting up my PowerPoint now. So It's just loading, so it should be up in a moment.
It's up now for me.
No, still loading on my end. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. So I'll turn off my camera just to make sure the bandwidth goes. So it's great to be with you for this MESCA project briefing today. So my economic update is split into three sections. Firstly, the immediate economic impact of COVID-19. Secondly, what shaped economic recovery we can expect. And finally, a quick overview of infrastructure, mining, and the energy pipeline. So as everyone already knows, Australia was in recession in the first half of 2020. The 7% contraction in the second quarter was the largest fall in GDP since quarterly data commenced in 1959. As shown in the chart, it truly was unprecedented, and I think that's probably been one of the most commonly used terms since COVID. And it was also the largest fall in annual terms as well. So the economy was on life support in the second quarter. Household consumption crashed, but strong growth in government spending and sold exports of iron ore cushioned the full impact on national economic growth. Australia's economic response to COVID-19 has been about supporting incomes and jobs. This has mainly been done through the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and superannuation withdrawal programs. The visualisation on the right shows the number of Australians on unemployment benefits, which is now called JobSeeker, since World War II, and it was formerly called New Start. The number of recipients has doubled because of the COVID recession and by the steep rise at the end. There are currently more than 1.5 million people receiving JobSeeker payments, many of whom have been unable to actively seek work, particularly in Victoria for obvious reasons. As activity restrictions are lifted, more people are expected to seek work, which will push the official unemployment rate higher, as it's pretty difficult to get a job at the moment because there are about 12 unemployed people for every vacancy in the country. Without JobKeeper and the increase in JobSeeker, Australia's unemployment rate would be approaching the all-time highs hit during the Great Depression. This chart shows Australia's unemployment rate since Federation, with an effective unemployment rate since COVID hit, which is that light blue line at the end. This latter measure includes those on JobKeeper who are not working, plus those who have become unemployed since March, but are not looking for work. It remains significant in the official unemployment rate, which peaked at 7.5% in July and is now but has fallen back to 6.9%. This effective rate peaked at 15.4% in April, but has now fallen back to 9.5%. But there's still a significant gap between those two measures. In terms of jobs, almost 1 million jobs were lost during the second quarter due to the pandemic and the associated activity restrictions. Since then, about half had returned by August, but this promising recovery largely stalled in September, as can be seen in this chart. Employment growth has fallen much harder and faster in 2020 compared to previous recessions. Job losses have now recovered to 1990s recession levels, and you can see there is a long way to go in the recovery. I also want to point out the split between Victoria and the rest of Australia, because it's somewhat similar to the 1990s recession. Though the causes are very different, Victorian employment was also hit harder than other states during the last recession. Back then, Victorian employment fell by 8.2% compared to 2.4% for the rest of Australia, and it took 8 years for Victorian employment levels to recover, compared to 4 years for the rest of Australia. Except for Victoria, the labour market has actually recovered faster than many expected this time around. Employment is now about 2% below pre-COVID-19 levels, after initially falling 7%. Similarly, hours worked are about 2% below pre-COVID levels, after falling nearly 10%. Victoria now accounts for a substantial share of the deterioration in the labour market. Since March, Victoria now accounts for half of the decline in employment, about 3/4 of the fall in total hours worked, 3/4 of the rise in people outside the labour force, and 2/3 of an increase in underemployment. So that's people who are working but want more hours. Now looking into the crystal ball, there has been a lot of commentary about what shape of economic recovery to expect. Should we expect a sustained depression, often referred to as an L-shaped recovery, or an unequal recovery, known as a K-shaped recovery, or a W-shaped recovery, which would be caused by a third wave? The answer is it depends. If you use growth rates, adjust the start and end points, or split your data, then you can just about make any shape you want. A good example of this is, of course, Donald Trump, and there's always a tweet, who tweeted out the chart on the left in August. Now, this chart is in fact not fake news and is actually correct. However, I would argue that is misleading. A more appropriate chart, given the magnitudes of volatility we have seen in the pandemic, is the one on the right, which shows the level of jobs. As you can see, the United States has recovered only about half the jobs from the initial hit of the pandemic, and the recovery looks to be slowing. So be careful if you see someone saying a V-shaped recovery is occurring when they accompany it with a growth chart. I would warn against using growth charts to describe the shape of recovery. Rather, we should be looking at absolute levels. Now on to the global outlook. The OECD's latest economic outlook says the global economy has in fact improved since June, but risks and uncertainty remain high. For those that don't know, the OECD is an organisation of 37 nations, mostly advanced economies, including Australia. They say the global economy is now at its weakest since World War II, with global GDP falling by 10% and trade volumes falling by 15% in the first half of the year. The OECD's base case is for global GDP to fall by 4.5% this year and then recover by 5% next year. This scenario could be better or worse depending upon the length of time required to control the pandemic and to rebuild confidence within businesses and communities. The upside scenario is, I would say, a Nike tick-shaped recovery, and the worst case scenario, which is that green dotted line, is more like a W-shaped recovery. Either way, I would make the argument that there's no V-shaped recovery back to that blue line, which is what would have occurred without COVID. Now, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, their outlook is very similar to the OECD's. They expect global growth to be better than first feared in 2020 when the pandemic initially hit, but they expect 2021 to be worse because of the lingering effects of COVID. GDP in the majority of countries is estimated to have fallen by at least 3% in 2020 in more than half of global economies. This contrasts with the global financial crisis, where only about half of countries experienced falling GDP, and most of them experienced 0 to minus 3%, which would be that yellow colour. As you can see on the map, there are very few countries coloured in green, with China as a notable exception. It estimates that COVID-19 has already cost the global economy $28 trillion in lost output this year. So looking specifically at the Australian outlook, recovery seems to be underway, but the outlook remains extremely fragile. The economy is expected to contract 1.5% this financial year, after contracting 0.2% last financial year, and that occurred all in that March to June period. Looking ahead to 2021 and beyond, Treasury's base case assumes falls in almost all components of GDP, except for mining investment and government spending. The Treasury's base case rests on the following key assumptions about COVID-19 and Australia's policy responses to it. So they assume no further national or statewide lockdowns after Victoria's second wave, all state borders to open up by the end of 2020, except for WA, which they assume to open by April 2021, vaccinations widely available to all Australians by late 2021, and international borders to open up by mid next year, with a gradual return of international students and permanent migrants later in the year, followed by international tourism. The chart on the right shows Australia's potential GDP from the government's economic update last Christmas in purple, so before COVID, and its latest budget post-COVID, along with forecasted GDP going forward. Potential GDP is estimated based on an analysis of trends for the 3 Ps of economic growth. And these 3 Ps are population, productivity, and participation. As can be seen in the chart, Australia's potential GDP, shown in blue, is significantly lower than what was previously forecasted back at Christmas, shown in purple. Now, why is this? It's because of lower levels of population and business investment, which will impact productivity and growth over an extended period of time. In terms of population, Treasury predicts 1 million fewer Australians in Australia by the end of next year than originally thought. That's the size of Adelaide. Fewer people means less economic activity. As shown in the chart, with all Australians vaccinated by the end of 2021, the government expects a Nike tick-shaped recovery. Of course, if there is a third wave, then that will be put into question. The immediate economic recovery depends on the course of the virus. Now on to a quick overview of the infrastructure, mining and energy pipeline. So firstly, infrastructure spending. The chart on the left shows the amount of engineering construction done in the mining states in red, so that is WA, Queensland and the Northern Territory, and the non-mining states, so that's the rest of the states. Engineering construction includes infrastructure, mining and heavy industrial resource-based projects. You can clearly see the mining investment boom from about 2011 to 2014 and the rise in infrastructure spending to accommodate strong population growth in New South Wales and Victoria from about 2016 to 2017. As can be seen on the right, the latest federal budget also outlined infrastructure investment grants to the states and territories under its Job Maker plan. There was a lot of additional funding for infrastructure, but at least some of this funding displaces state and territory funding previously committed to the same projects. However, it should free up the states and territories to spend funds on other projects, and it'll be interesting to see if they actually do. The pipeline of private infrastructure projects already started to decline in the second quarter. As can be seen in this chart, there remains a large pipeline of road, bridges, and rail projects waiting to be built. Engineering construction is expected to contract over this financial year as businesses defer or cancel investment commitments, and the development of new projects is halted or slowed amid ongoing uncertainty. However, this is from an elevated level. Public sector spending will be critical to filling some of this hole, and there have been a raft of announcements of new and fast-track projects from all levels of government. Turning to mining investment, the decline in mining construction work since the 2013 peak appears to be coming to an end, with a sustained increase in iron ore investment supported by elevated prices and offsetting weaknesses elsewhere. The chart on the left shows that although mining investment intentions this year are weaker than previously expected, investment expectations remain higher than what was spent last year. So that can be seen by the red dot, which was the intentions from Q4 2019, with the purple dot, which is Q2 from 2020. And as you can see, even with the impact of COVID, there is still expected to be more mining capex this financial year. The mining-related pipeline has been growing since its recent low as new projects are announced and maintenance on previous projects is undertaken. As can be seen by the chart on the right, iron ore capex increased to its highest level since 2014 in the last quarter. This has been underpinned by a handful of multi-billion-dollar projects. Now turning to renewable energy. Renewable generation increased 17% in 2018-19 and grew further in the 2019 calendar year, accounting for about 21% of total generation. Australia last saw a renewable share of total generation this high in the mid-1970s, when the Snowy Mountains hydro scheme was completed. There is a significant pipeline of renewable projects nearing construction or planning over the coming years, but there are growing challenges to the realisation of many of these projects. The Clean Energy Council estimates, as can be seen by the chart on the right, that 35 large-scale renewable energy projects were committed in 35 large-scale renewable energy projects in 1920, down from 47 in 2018-19. The total capacity of those projects committed in 2019-20 is also much lower than the previous 2 years. So the council assessed that grid connection challenges, underinvestment in network capacity, and policy uncertainty are key factors in the decline. The budget did confirm funding for ARENA, so that's the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, but they are planning on shifting the investment priorities of ARENA to other technologies. It appears that large-scale renewable energy will continue to be led by the states. And finally, I'd like to finish off with this chart because a common response we get from members, particularly in manufacturing or professional services, is concerning business profits. So in recent years, a lot of media commentary has been focused on business profits in comparison to wage growth. However, many CEOs and finance managers that I speak to always ask, like, where are these profits? I'm not seeing these profits. This chart goes a long way to explaining where those profits are accruing. So it's in the mining sector, where nominal profits are up about 200% since the recent low point at the start of 2016. This has been driven by both an increase in the price of our main export, iron ore, but also because of an increase in export volumes from the new liquefied national gas plants coming online in Queensland. And more recently, strong iron ore demand from China due to their recent infrastructure stimulus. And that's a result of the mining boom moving from the investment stage to the production stage. So this chart, I think, goes a long way to explaining that dichotomy that is happening in the economy. So to sum up, the key takeaways that I want you to go away with today is, firstly, the labour market is in significant contraction and will take time to recover. Secondly, in Australia at least, a recovery is underway, but it is fragile and dependent on the course of the virus. A Nike-tip-shaped recovery rather, is probably the best we can hope for. And there is a large pipeline of infrastructure, mining and renewable projects in the pipeline, but the development of these new projects are not immune to the uncertainty present in the economy. However, they are not probably not as liable to COVID-19 as other sectors are in the economy. So yeah, and I'd just like to finish up. I'd just like to mention that AI Group members can access any of our economic fact sheets, reports, and weekly economic updates as part of your membership. You just need to email us at that economics@aigroup.com.au. Yeah, back to you, James.
Thanks, Andy. Wow, there's a lot there. I like the idea that a recovery is going to happen. It's not going to happen to the pre-COVID, days of long gone, but there is recovery happening. I've got a quick question for you, picking up on something you were just saying. If the rest of the world does major infrastructure projects like Australia has announced they're going to, as part of the global recovery, let's just rebuild a whole lot of things so that we get jobs in place and, it's that kind of economic structure. Will that mean the Australian resource sector is going to be much more buoyant than indicated in your graphs? Is that factoring in what's happening in the rest of the world in terms of recovery?
No, it's not. So a good recent example of this is actually China. So in Australia, our economic recovery has been focused on incomes and jobs, and it's actually rather remarkable. It's the first time it's happened where we've had such a deep contraction in GDP, but actually people's disposable incomes have increased. And that's because of government support, as I mentioned, the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and superannuation withdrawal programs. Whereas other economies, so for example, China has just gone really hard on stimulus. So household and retail sales are actually fairly weak there, but their construction work and infrastructure spending is way up. And of course, that requires steel and that requires Australian iron ore. So that's why our exports have actually been quite buoyant over this period of time. And also the price of those exports, particularly iron ore, is higher as well because there's been supply disruptions across the world, most particularly in Brazil with the mining dam collapse, and as well because Brazil has been hit harder by COVID. So yeah, definitely around the world, there's different policy responses, and yeah, that definitely impacts demand for Australian resources.
Well, thanks, Andy. Fascinating. Hopefully that you are being on the cautious side, and it'll be better than ever. But it's all up to COVID, isn't it? But that's a great scene setting for Paul, who's going to talk to us not so much about economics, but more about what that kind of recovery might look like, what's happening, what the announcements are. Over to you, Paul. Let's see what good news you've got for us.
Look, thanks a lot, James, and thanks everyone for your participation today. And thanks, Andrew. That was a really great scene setter. It really has been an extraordinary year. And it's been a really interesting year for energy, and it's been very difficult, pretty much impossible actually, to distill it all into one presentation for you today. But hopefully it gives you a sense of what's happening in the energy and related field. There's a diversification happening. There's a lot of never waste a good crisis kind of pivoting that's happening this year. And I think it positions MESCA members really well into 2021. And I'll talk a little bit about what some of those opportunities might look like. or where to look, I guess, is probably more accurate. Just quickly, for those that don't know NERA is one of, we're a separate organisation, but we're funded by the federal government through the Industry Growth Centres Initiative, one of 6 industry growth centres in area of strategic competitive advantage. Our particular vision is Australia as a global energy powerhouse, a sought-after destination for investment, and the leading source of knowledge and solutions. I won't go into all the things that NERA does, but always happy to have a conversation with you about how we might be able to help you. If we go to the International Energy Agency and the global position, I mean, there's been an extraordinary contraction in energy usage this year. So previously there was global predictions of global primary energy demand to increase by 25% to 2040 by the International Energy Agency. That's possibly still likely as the economy is expected to come roaring back, and we still have global population growth. But if you actually look at this year, we've had energy demand contracting by about 7%, largest in 70 years in percentage terms, and the largest ever in absolute terms, larger than the impact of the 2008 financial crisis, and all fuels are affected. So oil demands have the biggest fall. It's back to oil consumption levels of 2012. Aviation's been a big one of that, but obviously lots of people, less cars on the road. So the mobile side of energy consumption. Coal demand down because of electricity demand being down, gas demand down, not quite so much, nuclear demand down. It was still increasing, and that's been an interesting area to watch. If we look at Australia's energy resources production, so this is the last financial year available statistics. The figures went up for every energy source in broad terms. Coal is also brown and black coal. Brown coal has continued to drop as a commodity that's produced in Australia. Black coal was up. So we're up to over 23,000 petajoules. We use about 6,500 in Australia across all fuel sources, and we actually import about 2,500 petajoules of that, mainly as diesel and refined petroleum products. But we're the largest exporter of LNG, we're the second largest exporter of coal, we've got the largest known uranium deposits, and our renewables are virtually untapped. It's really quite a position of strength that Australia comes from in the energy sector. And if you look at the most recent Department of Industry, Science and Energy and Resources statistics for the September quarter, our resources and energy exports have remained strong. So we've actually hit a record in this last financial year just gone of $290 billion. And despite the pressures, so a bit like through the GFC, the mining and energy sector and exports has really held up and positioned the Australian economy perhaps better than some of our peers. Export earnings will drop slightly down, but down to something like the 3rd and 4th highest on record, and over the next couple of years. So that's the projections. There's a little graph there. You can see little bumpy ones like little hills. South Korea, Japan, and China are our largest 3 exports. You know, what's really interesting about that is what's happening with net zero emissions, and I'll talk a little bit about that, commitments and aspirations. But as I said, our energy resources sector is really set up for a lot of success. We've got traditional sources of energy, we've got lots of renewables, we've got ammonia and hydrogen, we've got battery minerals, energy technologies and services, and we're still proximate to some of the fastest growing areas and with the largest energy and resource demand in the world. So what I often think of is, rather than talking about transition, this is really a diversification opportunity for Australia. And I'll talk through thematically, I suspect, what some of those the things that I'm seeing as we look through this year and into the future. And despite the downturn, a lot of people are putting economic activity into the energy sector. Here's just a number of headlines that have come through this year. We've seen renewable energy zones in New South Wales and Queensland. We've seen major project status for a couple of large exporting renewable projects out of Australia. We've seen record small-scale solar. Quite interesting that we're looking at being on track for about 6.3 gigawatts of solar across the economy this year in terms of added to capacity, and about half of that will come from small domestic rooftop systems. And we've had people like WA bringing forward their hydrogen plans by 10 years from 2040 to 2030 as well. and the Arrow Energy project, which I'll add a little bit on to later. Talked about net zero emissions. That's been something that's happened this year, and again, not when crisis hits, when downturn hits, you often get some changes. We've seen some commitments even in the last couple of weeks. So China, a few weeks ago, a commitment to net zero emissions by 2060. Japan by 2050. South Korea just this week by 2050. UK by 2050. They're our top 4 trading partners, and the top 3 are the top 3 that receive our exports of energy and resources. The US, I've got a question mark there. If there's a change of president next Tuesday, the new President Biden has got a commitment to as no later than 2050 to have the US as net zero emissions. That would take care of our top 5 trading partners looking at net zero emissions. And this year, there's been a whole range of companies in the energy and resource sector operating in Australia that have come out with commitments and aspirations for net zero emissions by 2050, including most of the majors. The interesting one just last week was ConocoPhillips. Most of the other ones, particularly Shell, BP, Total, really with a European strength, and given the EU's kind of ambitious targets on emissions, that makes sense. But ConocoPhillips has probably broken away from the pack in the US and North America to actually pledge for a net zero emission by 2050 as well. And a lot of these, particularly the stimulus, James and Andrew were just talking about stimulus packages overseas, particularly places like Germany and the EU, and some of our Asian trading partners have actually decided to put a lot of emphasis on economic recovery through, if you like, a low emissions future. So what are we doing in Australia? So a little while ago, there was a technology investment roadmap was released, 5 priority technologies and economic stretch goals. You'll see these themes come up quite a bit through my presentation, and I think it's a really good way of kind of joining the dots and looking at where the big opportunities are. So hydrogen's obviously a classic one. I'll talk a little bit about hydrogen. There's a goal to get hydrogen production under $2 Australian per kilogram, which would really open up those export markets. Long duration energy storage. So we know that solar in particular is time and place bound, but by being able to shift it with some storage, we'll be able to firm it up and create a much better offering from the solar sector. Low carbon materials is a big one. So particularly in steel and aluminium, but there's work being done across the energy materials and the minerals. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage has made a big comeback this year, aided and abetted a little bit by hydrogen as well. Hydrogen provides a way of potentially capturing CO2 from some of our gas and coal. And there's a massive project in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria looking at above ground coal gasification. It'll have Australia's first liquid hydrogen plant, and also the world's first ocean carrying liquid hydrogen vessel. And soil carbon as well, looking at a way of capturing carbon. The other one, which happened, it seems like years ago now, but it was only less than a year ago, was the National Hydrogen Strategy, a rare show of unity across states and territories in the Commonwealth to actually all get behind a national hydrogen strategy through the COAG Energy Council. There's 57 strategic actions across Australia's 9 governments and other stakeholders that's going through things like certification you might have seen this year. We've also developed up with CSIRO, the Cooperative Research Centre for Future Fuels and the Australian Hydrogen Council, a high resource. You can see the website link there. On the left-hand side is some mapping that's been done of projects by Geoscience Australia as well. Currently, we're tracking 54 large-scale demonstration and pilot projects and 29 major research programs. And as part of the National Hydrogen Strategy, we're also developing up a national hydrogen industry cluster to really make sure we capture the supply chain opportunities. We don't just want to run some construction projects on hydrogen using the world's technology, the world's capital, and the world's skills. We actually think there's a great opportunity in an emerging sector like hydrogen to build up the supply chain companies. and really be putting those into export chains. It's the MET sector, for example, which a lot of you work in. 38 of the world's largest 100 METS companies operate out of Australia, 9 each out of Canada and US are next. We would love to see a HET sector, a hydrogen equipment technology and services sector. So we've actually just closed a regional hydrogen technology cluster seed funding program. We're currently shortlisting that program, but hope to see a number of you join those clusters. In the gas sector, we've seen quite some big write-downs locally as well as globally. We've seen recently Woodside looking to axe quite a number of its staff, and the same with Origin Energy from its integrated gas business. Interestingly, talking to a supplier the other day, they were saying that from some of those cuts, it actually boosts the amount of work in the supply chain. The work still needs to be done. It's just not going to be done internally. So sometimes that's the silver lining in those projects. The Narrabri project of Santos has been approved by the Independent Planning Commission in New South Wales, and I talked about Arrow Energy greenlighting its project in the Surat as well back in April this year, which was good news for the gas sector. Renewable energy projects continue on. You can kind of see the amount that are tracked here each month by the Clean Energy Council is about $19 billion that are at financial close but not yet commissioned. I'll just move on. And then there's a third wave coming of export and industrial scale renewable energy projects. And these two projects, one a high voltage DC cable to Singapore, and the other one a green ammonia export project out of the Pilbara. And just down the bottom I've been to 2 presentations where Japanese have talked about how much solar capacity they would need to meet their green hydrogen out of Australia, and it's 1,800 gigawatts. I talked about 6 gigawatts being added in Australia at the moment. 1,800 gigawatts represents a bigger wave of renewable investment. And critical minerals. So Austrade's just put out a critical minerals prospectus and minerals projects that are happening. There's a critical minerals facilitation office. The Future Batteries Cooperative Research Centre was approved last year. And I've got a number of things down the side there in battery manufacturing and the like, right down to electric vehicles. And over $1 billion in investment into not just Future Battery Industries, CRC, but other cooperative research centres over the last couple of years. And Andrew talked about the more money into ARENA, but both Clean Energy Finance Corporation, ARENA, and CSIRO with their missions program and about another $450 million in the budget are all actually strongly into the sort of MESCA sphere of interest. So just some energy highlights from the federal budget. In the electricity, quite a bit of money being put into transmission projects, particularly the Marius Link project. There are some projects in microgrids and in cybersecurity, for example. In fuel security, there was $250 million to beef up our oil security with some new diesel fuel storage. In the gas supply areas, there's a 5-key basin plan looking at particularly the Beetaloo Basin, but also the North Bowen and Galilee Basins in Queensland. Some more money for CSIRO. In gas transport, there's going to be a national gas infrastructure plan looking at how gas can be transported around, and then also looking at an Australian gas hub and code of conduct, and also looking at how gas consumers can perhaps have more transparency around gas pricing in Australia. In the emissions reduction space, so again, ARENA receiving money, Technology Co-Investment Fund receiving money, a regional hydrogen export hub, carbon capture usage and storage development fund, and fuel efficient vehicles, and more money for the emissions reduction fund. So these all on their own look quite separate, but there is actually quite a strong narrative, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the other one is the modern manufacturing strategy, so 1.5 billion over 4 years. A key part of that is going to be the modern manufacturing initiative. There's a consultation out at the moment looking at developing up industry plans for those. But you'll see resources, technology and critical minerals processing, recycling and clean energy feature quite strongly in those. And I just wanted to really leave you then with, I think, what are the threads through that? So it does look like some of these things don't fit together. But what I think to really look for, if you're in the industry space, you're wondering where the future might lie, these are 10, what I would say, growth opportunities. They're not a project to tender for or anything of that specific, but it's kind of, these are areas that I think there's increased interest in manufacturing and R&D innovation, collaboration, local supply chain development, funding and projects, and clustering, dare I add, in all of these kind of areas. So the waste reduction and recycling area, hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, bioenergy. Arena's developing up a bioenergy roadmap at the moment. In that gigascale renewable generation that I talked about for exports and industrial activity, more increasingly in renewable energy storage, in that critical minerals, low emission metals and battery manufacturing space, right through the supply chain. In a lot of cases, actually powered by renewable energy. And then the renewable energy technologies are being built from critical minerals and actually even built in Australia. So I think for one of the first times, and maybe even in decades, this value adding opportunity from our resources through to manufacturing is very strong. We're also seeing an increasing electrification of industry and transport, other low emission technologies in the gas space, the Arrow Surat project in Santos Narrabri, but then also the increasing interest in getting the Beetaloo Basin to market as quick as possible, and some of those other gas basins that I mentioned. So it's quite a whistle-stop tour through it, but I hope you see some interest in there, and maybe it's in some of the complexity of where the sector is. I think there's great opportunities to really reflect on your capability, reflect on what your customers are doing, what's happening in the industry, and then position yourself well for 2021 and beyond. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Paul. Wow. Wow. There's a lot from both of you there. The thought that comes to mind is in Andrew highlighting that we've got a recovery in place, but it's fragile. And then you show all that opportunities, Paul. The challenge is for MESCA members is to say, well, how do I figure that out? How do I decide which way to go? Maybe we need to spend some time next year working through those ideas about how do we figure it out? Is there a winner there? Is gas the winner, or is hydrogen or battery storage? What?
Yeah, look, I think there's many winners. And I'm an optimist, James. We've known each other long enough for you to know that I'm by nature an optimist. But I look at Australia and I go for our domestic conversations about energy and debates about energy and about emissions and about climate change and everything. I really look at all the assets we've got across the country, all the strengths we've got, and I look increasingly at a world that wants more energy. It wants low emission energy. There's localization of supply chain opportunities that are coming out of things like COVID. We've got the buffet, right? We've got the energy, materials, manufacturing capability, resource buffet that the rest of the world wants to gorge itself on. And increasingly it's a diversification story for Australia, and a deepening of those supply chains. I think it's a great opportunity, and we are principally a global player when it comes to energy. We export more than 2/3 of our energy.
I'm going to use that term, the buffet. That's a good one. Just before we wrap up, Andy, is there any kind of feedback on the profitability of the new energy sectors? You talked about the mining sector being, very profitable. Are we at profit stage yet, or is it still in the startup phase?
Well, I actually think Paul's probably better equipped to answer that question on the other energy sectors.
He's an optimist. He's going to say yes.
But just to add on what Paul said, I think there's massive opportunities in the energy sector for Australia. And including in our supply chains, manufacturing. We saw how Australian manufacturers adapted very quickly to, the supply constraints. You had manufacturers making hand sanitizers, adapting their factory lines to make PPE. So Australian manufacturers actually adapted very quickly. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, including in the hydrogen space going forward. Yeah, in terms of profitability, though, I mean, yeah, there's a massive demand, particularly in Asia, for it. So I can't see why it won't be profitable.
Okay. On a slightly different note, one of the questions that came up earlier today, I think this is probably to you, Andy, is that with all the infrastructure projects that are happening, and also with the shift away from retail stores to online deliveries, we're seeing a much greater demand for warehousing. All that infrastructure is going to need warehousing and hard stand. Online deliveries need warehousing. And of course, with the disruption of supply chains, we need greater inventories in our businesses. Is there any feedback in the economic, is there any economic data on where we're at in terms of physical infrastructure for small business? Can we get warehousing? Should we invest in it? Any feedback on that at all?
So particularly around building approvals for warehousing, so that has been going up significantly since 2017. So that's the value of building approvals for warehousing. So that is probably at least driven in part by higher land costs, but it's also probably driven by a higher quantity of warehousing as well. Another aspect is, if you have a look at Singapore, for instance, they've got really high land costs, not a lot of land. Their warehousing is multi-stories, whereas most of Australia's warehousing is on a single story. Sure. In the outer suburbs. Obviously, most people, our cities, Melbourne and Sydney are, population density is quite high. I think the average delivery, the average truck speed in Melbourne City a few decades ago was 40 kilometres an hour. Now it's 17 kilometres an hour. Nice. So I think going forward, there's definitely going to be some changes around that warehousing, but we are seeing quite a significant increase in warehousing as online sales move. The rise of online sales.
Yeah, right. It's an interesting point to consider, though, isn't it? Because that physical infrastructure is what we're going to need in order to deliver on building the infrastructure.
Yeah,
it's that great challenge of rebuilding the economy.
And that's the other thing. I mean, you see a lot of headlines around, so many billion in infrastructure. But the thing is, we've lagged behind for decades with our infrastructure spending. So we're still playing catch up.
Paul, is that renewable energy going to be built in, accessible areas, or is it going to be in the middle of Australia? Where is this industry going to be built?
I think it's renewable energy by its nature is quite distributed. But Australia's got some of the best solar intensity in the world, along with sort of Northern Africa and the Middle East. So, you are going to have, I think, large, potentially export-focused or underpinning an industrial region plants. But I think we're also going to see much more linking together of virtual power plants and microgrids across much more distributed. I mean, the IKEA announcement, Audi's announcement, Coles, a lot of these big places with roof space are now looking at how they effectively take themselves almost off the grid and actually do their own. And we're seeing a lot of that in the manufacturing sector. It's not a case of bitching and moaning about your retailer anymore. It's about potentially taking control. And I actually see regions doing the same, where you've been a net exporter of coal or gas-fired power into the grid. You can actually, if you've got access to renewables, you've got access to other things, you can make an unbeatable deal for a region, keep the energy close, keep it cheap, keep it low emission, and drive a whole bunch of value-adding activity to your region, where perhaps before it was just the molecules and the electrons that you were exporting.
Yeah, it's a whole new way of thinking about things, isn't it? It's this whole distributed model, and at a time when we are putting up barriers because of COVID, it's becoming actually a smaller world where we're living closer. Look, fascinating conversation. Have you got anything? I've got a very clever tagline to finish, thanks to you, Paul. But have you got anything else that you want to add before? Tell us about 21. How do you feel about 2021?
Are you going first, Andrew, or I go first?
Oh, you go. Oh, okay, I'll go first. So I guess in terms of our jobs recovery, it's really dependent on the virus. But as we've seen this week, there's a lot of pent-up demand in the economy. There's lots of, you saw lines outside Kmart at midnight. People just want to go out and spend their money and get life back to normal. So I think if we can control the virus, Australia's in a very good position to recover.
Yeah, look, and I think 2021 is probably not looking as different as we thought it might have done in the first half of 2020 when we were thinking that, everything was going to open back up by about July this year. But I think one of the things that's been really interesting is that we've actually accelerated, whether it's remote operations, whether it's working from home. Governments have potentially done and pivoted and done things that they wouldn't otherwise have done. I think in some ways we might have been, this is probably a controversial thing to say, but maybe we'd been a bit captive to 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth. And actually, there's been a refreshing kind of, actually we can do a whole range of things, and it's actually driven collaboration and creativity to higher levels than I've seen for probably for a couple of decades.
Success is its own disaster. It causes us to get fat, dumb, and happy. So yeah, maybe this is what's going to happen. Certainly, we will remember 2020 as the year in which our lives changed. And I think with your messages, we're going to say it's the year in which we got ready for 2021. So we're heading towards Christmas in all the Christmas functions. And when I'm at those buffets that don't exist anymore, but if I was at a buffet, I will keep in mind the fact that we have a buffet of opportunities for 2021. See, thank you for laughing at that. MESCA, I think, is well positioned on all these things. We're going to look at a lot at the areas that you talked about, Paul, as well as the traditional areas. And on that, it's 4:29. It's time to wrap up. I wish everybody, look, for the first time, a Merry Christmas, a great 2021. Congratulations on surviving. And in future, when we talk about we have 2020 hindsight, it'll mean different from what it used to, won't it? But for that, thank you very much. And we'll talk in the new year. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you
Thanks,
very much, everyone.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks. Bye.